I can still hear the scrape of the chair against the kitchen floor. It was a normal morning, or at least, it started that way. The sunlight was spilling through the window, catching the steam rising from my coffee. The smell was rich and warm, the kind that usually made the house feel alive. I'd been sitting in the same spot where I'd packed their lunchboxes for years, where I'd watched them rush off to school with mismatched socks and crumbs on their cheeks. But that morning, they weren't rushing anywhere. They were already seated across from me, my son, Mark, and my daughter, Elise. Mark was buttering a slice of toast, like it was any other day. No urgency, no warning. Then he said it. "We've decided you're no longer part of the family." Just like that. The words didn't even sound real at first, like he was reading a line from a play. I looked at him, waiting for some kind of smirk, some sign he was joking. But Elise just stared at me, her eyes steady and cold, and then she nodded. I laughed. I actually laughed, a short, nervous sound that didn't belong to me. What are you talking about?" I asked. Mark didn't look up from his plate. "We think it's best if you're not involved anymore. We'll handle things from here." Handle what? I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Only a week ago, I'd signed over the house to them, the same $1 million home I'd spent my life protecting. I thought I was giving them security, a gift. Now they were cutting me out like an unwanted page from a book. The smell of coffee turned bitter in my nose. The morning light, once warm, felt like it was spotlighting me in the middle of a crime I didn't commit. I stared at Elise. "Is this a joke?" She shook her head slowly, then reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. She slid it across the table. "This explains it," she said flatly. I didn't touch it. Mark finally looked up, and there was no warmth in his face. "It's an agreement," he said. "It just says you won't be part of any family decisions going forward. No interference." I blinked at him. Interference? In my own family? He pushed his plate aside. "You've done enough, Mom. It's time we take over." The word mom sounded sharp, not loving, not mine anymore. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. The edges of the room blurred. I didn't want them to see my hands shaking, so I stood up, walked to the sink, and ran the tap just to hear something other than their voices. When I turned back, they were already gathering their things. Elise placed the envelope in front of me like it was a final notice. Mark glanced at the clock. "We'll give you some time to read it over. We'll be in touch." They walked out the front door without another word. The sound of it closing echoed through the kitchen like the slam of a vault. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty chairs. The coffee had gone cold. The toast was untouched. I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of legal papers, full of language that sounded polite but felt like a cage. Words like authority and exclusion jumped out at me. My role was reduced to nothing more than a name on a page. I don't remember deciding to pack, but suddenly I was in my bedroom, pulling clothes into a small overnight bag. Not my whole life, just enough to get me out of there before I broke. When I reached the study to grab some important documents, my eyes landed on the corner cabinet, the one that had been in that room for decades. Inside, hidden behind old tax files, was a small, fireproof safe. My late husband and I had always kept the key tucked away in a specific place. Out of habit, I checked, and there it was, still where I'd left it. Without thinking, I slipped it into my pocket. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe it was something deeper, some quiet part of me that already knew I'd need it. I closed my bag, stepped outside, and pulled the door shut behind me. They thought they had everything now, but they didn't know about the safe, and they had no idea just how much power one small key could hold. When I walked out that morning, I told myself I was leaving just for a few days. But the truth was, I didn't know if I'd ever walk back into that house again. 2 days later, I found myself standing at the edge of the driveway, staring at it from the street. It looked exactly the same: pale blue siding, white trim, the lilac bush leaning slightly over the porch rail. But something felt different. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a stranger wearing my family's face. I could still picture the first day we saw it, nearly 30 years ago. My husband had grinned at the wide front porch and said, "This is where we'll raise them." And we did. Those walls had heard first words, teenage arguments, and the sound of Christmas mornings before dawn. I used to think a house was just wood and nails until we moved in. Then it became something else, a witness. It knew us better than anyone. When my husband passed, I promised myself I'd keep it. Even when bills piled up, even when I had to work extra shifts. There were nights I sat in the kitchen with my head in my hands wondering how I'd make the mortgage, but I always found a way. For them, I thought they loved it as much as I did. I was wrong. Looking back now, I can see the signs. Elise walking through the living room one afternoon, tapping the walls and murmuring about opening it up. Mark standing on the back deck, asking how much the property taxes were these days in that casual tone that's never really casual. At the time, I told myself it was just curiosity, kids noticing things. But now, those moments feel like rehearsals for what came next. The memory that keeps sticking in my mind is the study my husband's study. He'd built the shelves himself, stained them the exact color of the old desk he found at a flea market. That desk still sat in the corner, the safe hidden behind it. I'd dusted that desk every week since he died, never thinking the safe would mean anything again. But now, I thought about it every hour. Because inside was more than money or jewelry. There were papers, important ones, things my husband had insisted we keep safe. And in the weeks before he passed, he'd slipped something else inside. Something my kids didn't know existed. I didn't know exactly why I'd kept the key in my pocket when I left. Maybe I just wanted to hold on to one thing they couldn't take. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that little piece of metal might be the only thing standing between me and losing everything. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time that day, just looking at the house. The curtains in the living room were open, and for a moment, I saw Elise moving around inside. She didn't look out the window. She didn't know I was there. It hit me then this wasn't my home anymore in their eyes. To them, it was square footage, market value. To me, it was 30 years of my life. As I turned to leave, my fingers brushed against the safe key in my pocket. It felt warm, almost like it had a heartbeat of its own. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing: I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The morning after I'd stood outside the house, I was sitting in a small rented room above a corner bakery, drinking coffee that didn't taste like home. I was trying not to think about Mark and Elise when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Nadine, my oldest friend. She was holding a paper bag that smelled faintly of cinnamon and warm bread. "You didn't answer your phone," she said, brushing past me like she'd been invited. "I didn't feel like talking," I muttered. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set the bag on the little table and pulled out 2 crusty rolls. "Eat," she said, sliding one toward me. "And then you can tell me why you look like you've been hit by a truck." I tried to laugh it off, but Nadine's eyes didn't leave mine. She's always been like that, no patience for polite lies. Finally, I told her everything: the kitchen, the words, the envelope, how I'd walked out. When I finished, she sat back silent. She tore a piece of bread, chewed slowly, then said, "I knew something was off." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then leaned in. "A week ago, I was at the hardware store. Ran into a guy I know. He's a contractor. He mentioned Mark had called him about getting a quote for updates on the house. Said they wanted it ready for photos in the spring." The words hit like ice water. "Photos? What kind of photos?" "The kind you put in a real estate listing," she said. I stared at her. My mind scrambled to find another explanation. Maybe it was for insurance or a home appraisal. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. Mark and Elise weren't planning to live in that house. They were planning to sell it. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, Nadine went on. But then I saw Elise last week. She was walking out of that new realtor's office on Main Street, carrying a folder. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. They wouldn't, not without telling me. Her expression softened. "Sweetheart, sometimes the people we think would never hurt us already have. You just haven't seen the proof yet." The room felt smaller. The noise from the bakery below sounded distant. I thought back to Elise's cold stare, Mark's steady voice when he told me I was no longer part of the family. It wasn't sudden. This had been building for months, maybe longer. Nadine reached into her bag again and pulled out a small white envelope. "Just in case," she said. I frowned and took it from her. Inside was a business card with a name I didn't recognize. "Who's this?" "An attorney I trust. She helped my aunt when her son tried something similar." The card felt heavier than it should. I slid it back into the envelope. "I'm not ready for that," I said quietly. "You don't have to be ready," Nadine replied. "You just have to know you have options." We sat in silence for a moment. I could feel her watching me, not with pity, but with the kind of concern that sees the cracks before they spread. Before she left, She paused at the door and said, "You still have that old safe, right? The one in your husband's study?" The question made me tense. Why? Her eyes flicked to my pocket, like she already knew the key was in there. Because sometimes what's locked away isn't just worth money. It's worth keeping your life your own. She left me standing there with the key pressing against my thigh. I didn't know exactly what she meant, but I had the feeling I was going to find out. 3 days passed after Nadine's visit, each one longer than the last. I told myself I was resting, catching my breath, but the truth, I was listening. Listening for what? I didn't even know. Until it happened. I'd gone back to the house late one afternoon. I still had my keys, they hadn't changed the locks. The excuse I gave myself was that I needed to grab some of my winter clothes. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint. There were drop cloths in the hallway, and voices. I froze in the entryway, my ears straining. Mark's voice, low but clear. "If we can get the photos done by next month, we'll have it listed before summer." A woman's voice answered, not Elise's. Someone I didn't know. "I'll send over the staging proposal this week." My stomach turned. They weren't just thinking about selling. They were already moving forward. And they hadn't even told me. I didn't make a sound. I backed away from the door, closed it quietly, and went around to the side of the house. The study window was cracked open, and from there I heard them wrap up the conversation. Mark mentioned timelines. The woman said something about the market being hot right now. By the time I slipped back inside through the kitchen door, they were gone. But their voices were still ringing in my ears. I walked straight to the study. The desk was exactly how I'd left it. I moved it just enough to open the cabinet door, then knelt down and unlocked the fireproof safe. The smell of old paper rushed out at me. Inside, neatly stacked, were folders my husband and I had organized years ago: property deeds, mortgage records, tax receipts. But under those was a thin, sealed envelope with my husband's handwriting on it. It was dated just 2 weeks before he died. I sat back on my heels, my hands trembling as I slid it open. Inside was a single typed page, an addendum to his will. In plain, unflinching language, it stated that the house could not be sold, transferred, or otherwise disposed of without my explicit written consent. Not just while I was alive, but for the full term of my life, even if ownership was transferred. And it was signed, witnessed, notarized. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. This was my shield. I pulled out my phone, took clear photos of every page, then slid the envelope back into the safe exactly where I found it. I wasn't ready to confront them yet, not without a plan. Over the next few days, I started collecting things, quietly. I dug out emails from Mark and Elise, especially the ones where they'd pressured me to sign over the house for convenience. I printed out text messages. I even jotted down memories, dates, conversations, the tone of their voices. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was building something, a wall they wouldn't see until it was too late. I let them think they were winning. When Elise called to ask if I'd had time to settle in at my rented place, I told her I was fine. When Mark texted that the paperwork was almost ready, I replied with a simple, "Okay." On the surface, I was quiet. Underneath, I was moving pieces into place. Late one night, I sat at the little table in my rental with Nadine's attorney's card in front of me. My thumb hovered over the phone, but I didn't call. Not yet. I wanted them to walk right into their own trap first. When I finally put the card away, I slipped the safe key onto a thin chain and wore it around my neck, tucked under my sweater. It wasn't just a key anymore. It was a reminder that I wasn't as powerless as they thought. They believed I'd walked away with nothing. But what they didn't count on was that I still held the one thing that could keep the house and my life out of their hands forever. It was a Wednesday when Mark called. He didn't ask if I was free, he simply said, "We're coming by tomorrow with the final papers. Elise is bringing dinner." It sounded less like an invitation and more like a meeting I was expected to attend. I hung up without asking questions. If this was the game they wanted to play, I'd let them think they were winning until the very last move. The next evening, they arrived right on time. Elise swept into the kitchen with a takeout bag from that trendy new place downtown. Too much food for 3 people, like they were trying to butter me up before the kill. Mark carried a sleek leather folder tucked under his arm. We made small talk while she plated the food. I sat at the table, smiling, nodding, letting them believe I was still the same woman who signed whatever they put in front of me without a fight. It wasn't until after dessert that Mark finally pulled out the folder and set it on the table. "This is the final version," he said. "Once you sign, everything will be official. It's just a formality at this point." I tilted my head. "Just a formality?" "Exactly," he said, smiling like a salesman. "It's all the same as before, just cleaned up." Elise chimed in. "It'll make things easier for everyone. No more back and forth." I reached for the folder, but instead of opening it, I slid another set of papers from my bag and placed them neatly on top. Mark frowned. "What's this?" "A small addition," I said lightly. "Just something to protect me in case things shift." He opened the page and his eyes went straight to the highlighted paragraph, my clause. It stated that any transfer of rights would only become effective 45 days after signing, and during that period I could revoke it for any reason. The smile dropped from his face. "This isn't standard. Neither is being told I'm no longer part of my own family," I replied. Elise tried to recover, her tone almost sweet. "We thought you trusted us." "I do," I said evenly. "But trust and protection aren't the same thing." Mark leaned back in his chair, scanning the page again. "Our lawyer didn't include this." "No," I said, meeting his eyes. "This came from a lawyer I trust." Silence. Elise's fingers tapped the edge of her plate. Mark finally pushed the papers back toward me. "We'll need to review this before moving forward." "Of course," I said. "Take all the time you need." They gathered their things quickly after that, the friendly small talk gone. The air between us was colder than it had been when they arrived. When the door shut behind them, I let out the breath I'd been holding. They thought they were calling the shots, but now they'd have to rewrite their plan, and that meant I was buying time. I went straight to the study and unlocked the safe. The original deed, my husband's addendum, and now the signed, notarized copy of my clause all sat together in one folder. I tucked it back inside, locked it, and slipped the key under my sweater where it belonged. That night, I lay in bed replaying every look, every pause at the table. They hadn't expected pushback, and now they had to figure out how to move forward without tipping their hand. The next morning, an envelope slid under my rental door. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a new version of the agreement. My clause was gone, replaced by a different one entirely. This one stated that once the transfer was signed, it could not be altered or revoked under any circumstances. It was a trap disguised as efficiency. I sat at the table staring at it until the afternoon light faded. They were moving faster now. Afraid I might change my mind, or maybe afraid I already had. That evening, I picked up the phone and called the attorney whose card Nadine had given me. I didn't just explain the situation, I sent her copies of everything: the original agreement, my added clause, the new final version, and most importantly, photos of my husband's will addendum from the safe. She called me back within the hour. Her voice was calm but firm. "You have leverage," she said. "A lot of it. And if they try to file anything without your consent, we can shut it down immediately." For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night, not because I believed it was over, far from it, but because I knew something they didn't. They were walking into a fight they couldn't win, and all I had to do was let them keep thinking I was still playing their game. 2 days after sending everything to the attorney, I sat in her office with a cup of coffee that tasted stronger than anything I'd had in weeks. Across from me, she had the will addendum, spread out on her desk, the gold notary seal catching the light. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is ironclad. If they sell without your written consent, the transaction can be nullified even after closing. No buyer will touch that risk." Hearing it out loud made my chest loosen. For weeks I'd felt like I was clinging to a fraying rope. Now, it was like my feet had found solid ground again. She explained the plan: file an injunction to prevent any transfer, notify the county records office, and put a hold on the title so no one could make changes without me being informed. It was a shield, and it was going up immediately. By the time I left her office, the paperwork was already in motion. Back at my rental, I unlocked the safe again, partly to check, partly because touching those documents reminded me of who I was before all this started. The safe's metal door opened with its familiar click, and there it was: the addendum, the deed, the mortgage records, and a thick manila folder of old correspondence between my husband and our bank. But there was something else I hadn't noticed before. Tucked in the back, wrapped in an aging envelope, was a letter addressed to me in my husband's handwriting. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I unfolded it. His words were short but deliberate: "If you're reading this, something has made you question your place in this house. Let me be clear, you are the heart of it. Keep the documents safe, and keep yourself safer. Trust slowly, love fully." but never surrender what you've built. I sat there for a long time, staring at his handwriting. It felt like he'd left it not just for some distant future, but for this exact moment. I slipped the letter back into its envelope and placed it on top of the other documents, a quiet reminder of why I was doing this. That night, my attorney called again. They've been talking to a realtor, she said. She's the one who had the staging proposal ready. We've served notice to her office that the property is in dispute. I imagine Mark and Elise sitting at a polished desk, hearing the realtor explain that the house wasn't theirs to sell, not without me. The image warmed me in a way I didn't expect. For so long, I'd been the one caught off guard. Now, they were the ones scrambling. The next day, Mark texted me, "We need to talk. Urgent." I didn't respond. An hour later, Elise called. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't avoiding them out of fear anymore. I was controlling the timing. In the quiet, I walked through every step in my head: the injunction, the recorded hold on the title, the will addendum locked in my safe. Piece by piece, I'd build a wall they couldn't climb without me seeing them coming. By evening, I sat at the little kitchen table, the safe key warm against my skin under my sweater. I realized that for the first time since they'd told me, I was no longer their mother. I didn't feel like I was reacting to their moves. I was making my own. They thought the safe just held dusty papers. What it really held was the one thing they couldn't manipulate, reword, or erase: proof. And proof, in the right hands, is more powerful than any signature they can trick you into giving. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning. The attorney called it mediation, but I knew it was going to feel more like a courtroom without the gavel. Mark and Elise would be there. So would a neutral mediator. My job was simple: tell the truth and back it up. When I walked into the conference room, they were already seated at the far end of the table. Mark avoided my eyes. Elise gave me a quick, polite nod, the kind you give a stranger. The mediator, a woman in her 50s with a calm voice and sharp eyes, started by summarizing the dispute. She mentioned the pending injunction, the hold on the property, title, and the will addendum that clearly stated my rights. Then she looked at me. "Would you like to add anything?" I took a slow breath. "Only that I never agreed to give up my home. Any claim that I did is false." The mediator nodded, then turned to them. "Mark, Elise?" Mark leaned forward. "We were trying to secure the family's future." Mom misunderstood. "The paperwork she's talking about, she gave it to us willingly. Maybe she doesn't remember signing." That last part twisted my stomach. It was subtle, but it was an insult wrapped in fake concern. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached into my bag and set a small audio recorder on the table. With one click, the room filled with voices: mine, Mark's, and a third voice belonging to a woman named Beth, the so-called family advisor they'd brought to my house weeks earlier. On the recording, you could hear me asking Beth to explain the changes made to the agreement. You could hear her confirm they'd removed my clause, and that the document was final and binding. Her tone was casual, but her words were anything but innocent. The mediator let the recording play until the end, then clicked it off. Her gaze shifted to Mark and Elise. "This doesn't sound like a misunderstanding. This sounds like coercion." Mark's jaw tightened. Elise looked down at her hands. I kept my voice steady. "They didn't expect me to have proof, but I do. I have the will addendum notarized. I have the title hold, and I have this recording. That's why we're here." For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy. Finally, the mediator asked me, "Do you wish to continue negotiations or move forward with legal resolution?" I didn't hesitate. "I want my rights upheld. I want the house protected. And I want no contact from them unless it's through counsel." She nodded. "Then that's the recommendation I'll record." Mark pushed his chair back sharply. "So that's it? You're just going to lock us out?" I met his eyes. "I'm locking out anyone who tries to take what isn't theirs." He opened his mouth to speak again, but Elise touched his arm. They gathered their things and left without another word. When the door closed, I stayed in my seat for a moment, listening to the quiet. My attorney put a hand on my shoulder. "They won't try this again. Not with what you've got." I didn't answer right away. I was still letting it sink in. The shift. For months, they'd been the ones in control. But in that room, the balance had tipped. When I finally left the building, the sun was warm on my face. The city noise felt softer somehow. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't walking away from something they'd done. I was walking towards something I'd claimed for myself. That night, I went back to the house. Alone, I walked from room to room, touching the door frames, the shelves, the windowsills. I paused in the study and ran my fingers along the safe's cold metal door. The key was still warm against my chest, and I realized it wasn't just a way to open steel. It was a reminder that no matter how much they tried to erase me, I still had the final say. A week after the mediation, an envelope arrived by courier. No return address, just my name typed neatly on the front. Inside were 2 pages. The first was formal, the kind of letter that hides its real meaning in polite, legal phrases. It said they respected my decision, that all communication would now go through their attorney. They wished me peace. The second page was handwritten. Mark's voice was in the words, but it was distant. He said he hadn't realized how strongly I felt about the house, that maybe they'd pushed too hard, that their intention was never to hurt me. Not once did he say I'm sorry, just maybe, and I thought. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. It didn't sting like I thought it would. It just felt done. The next morning, I called my attorney. I want to put the house into a trust, I told her. One that can't be touched. Not now, not ever. 2 weeks later, Nadine came with me to the notary's office. She wore her sun hat and a linen blouse like we were going to lunch instead of signing something that would change everything. We laughed in the car, but when the papers were placed in front of me, the room went quiet. The trust was simple. The house would remain mine until my last day. After that, it wouldn't pass to Mark or Elise. It would go to a community housing group that restores old homes for women over 60 who've lost theirs to financial abuse or family disputes. I signed my name slowly, feeling the weight of every letter. When I was done, Nadine put her hand on mine. You sure? I nodded. I'm more sure about this than I've been about anything in years. We stopped for coffee afterward, sitting by the window of a small cafe downtown. The sun caught in the steam rising from my cup. Nadine asked, "What will you do now?" I smiled. Live, not just survive. Live. I started making a list in my head: repaint the kitchen, plant mint in the garden, maybe take a bus to the coast this fall. For the first time in months, the list wasn't about what I needed to fix or defend. It was about what I wanted. That afternoon, I went home and walked down the hallway. The family photo that used to hang there, Mark and Elise on the porch, smiling like they meant it was gone. In its place, I hung a watercolor my friend Sylvia had painted years ago. A quiet house by a lake, still and peaceful. The change felt right. Some things you keep because they honor your life, others you let go because they don't. When the holidays came, the silence in the house was thick but not heavy. I decorated the mantel with only the pieces that made me smile. The pinecone angel my mother made, the ceramic village I almost gave away once. No traditions done out of obligation. On Christmas Eve, I made a roast and set one place at the table mine. I lit a candle and poured a glass of wine. It wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. Later, I sat in my favorite chair by the front window, the safe key warm in my palm. I wasn't holding it because I needed to protect the papers anymore. I was holding it because it reminded me of the moment I stopped letting other people decide my worth. Out on the street, the snow had just started to fall. I watched it land quietly on the lilac bush by the porch, and I thought about how some storms don't come with thunder. Some come as a hush, a final settling, and in that hush, I realized something simple and powerful. The house was still mine, but more importantly, so was I.